Hello there. If you're looking for a quiet moment to relax, just close your eyes and let your mind drift gently into the distant past. Today, we'll journey together into the ancient world of Rome, radiant, powerful, and full of secrets. But before we explore the darker corners of this grand empire, take a minute for yourself. Breathe deeply and let all your worries fade away. At the height of its glory, the Roman Empire was not only a center of military and political power, but also the pinnacle of ancient Western art, architecture, and civilization. Smoothly paved stone roads stretched for hundreds of miles, connecting the vast territories from the British Isles to the Egyptian deserts. Testaments to the Romans' extraordinary vision and engineering. They invented the aqueduct system, channeling fresh mountain water into the heart of Rome to serve millions of citizens. Monuments like the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Baths of Caracalla were not just functional structures, but eternal symbols of power, order, and grandeur. The capital, Rome, rose like a jewel in the Mediterranean, where sunlight gleamed off marble domes and intricately carved statues of gods. Expansive squares bustled with life. Merchants, politicians, poets, soldiers, and everyday citizens mingled under the watchful eyes of history. Here, the art of oratory was revered as much as the might of legions. Roman lawmakers ruled not just by force, but by laying foundations of a legal system that still echoes in modern societies. Latin was taught, Greek philosophy was adapted and shared, and libraries brimmed with handwritten manuscripts from across the ancient world. From distant battlefields, Roman legions returned to thunderous cheers, hailed as heroes. They marched down flag-draped streets, parading prisoners and spoils of war, bringing pride and prosperity to Rome. Their victories became the tales recited by families at night, reinforcing the myth of an invincible empire. But as you pass through Rome's stone gates and peer deeper into the machinery of its society, a stark reality emerges, a quiet, haunting darkness. Beneath the marble columns and the cobbled roads leading to triumphs, there are cramped underground chambers where thousands of chained souls labored in despair. These were the slaves, the silent yet indispensable foundation of Rome's magnificence. They were people without names, without rights, without destinies. They came from everywhere. Gauls captured in battle, Greek children sold into bondage, African prisoners led in chains from the south. They cooked in aristocratic villas, served in noble households, and toiled on massive agricultural estates, latifundia, that fed the city of Rome. Without them, noble banquets could not be prepared, roads would remain unfinished, water would not flow, and legions would have no tents waiting after their campaigns. The very monuments at Rome took pride and were built with the sweat, blood, and lives of millions of slaves. The Colosseum, where cheers erupted with every clash, was also where slaves were turned into sacrifices for public amusement. As Roman spectators relaxed under vaulted canopies, enjoying brutality as entertainment, the slaves stepped into the arena with despair, without the faintest hope of survival. In the shadowy corners of Rome, as night fell, the wind carried not melodies but the laments of forgotten lives. Children were born stamped as slaves, never to know freedom. Women were raped by their masters. Men who had once been warriors, scholars, musicians, were now forced to kneel and serve a world they had never chosen. Rome may take pride in its knowledge, laws, and art, but one cannot ignore that all of this stood on a fractured foundation built through injustice. The empire's grandeur, upon closer inspection, is not just a glow of glory. It is a blinding light that masks the truth, a society that preserved its dominance through systemic exploitation. And the longer this prosperity lasted, the deeper those hidden sufferings became. The erasure of the enslaved from history does not mean they never existed. Every stone in the city may bear the mark of a slave once beaten, chained, or fallen. Every classical tune played in ancient halls may have passed through the trembling fingers of someone who was forbidden to be called a citizen. When we admire the wonders of Rome today, the right response is not only awe for its brilliance and power, but also a moment of silent remembrance, a remembrance of the voices never heard, the eyes never met, and the people, though nameless, who built one of the greatest civilizations in human history. They are the shadow behind the light, the truth behind the splendor. And if we dare to truly see them, Rome becomes not just a symbol of might, but a profound lesson in lost humanity. In the popular imagination of the Roman Empire, People often envision grand arenas, endless stone-paved roads, and powerful emperors seated on gilded thrones under the radiant glow of power. But behind that golden image lies a brutal and almost unimaginable reality, a society fueled by blood, bones, and the total erasure of the rights to life for millions. This was Roman slavery, a system of enslavement so vast and savage that it far surpasses many other slave-based societies in human history. At the height of Rome's power, around the 1st century BCE and CE, it's estimated that roughly 1/3 of the population of the Italian peninsula were slaves. In the city of Rome itself, the heart of the empire, that number may have reached as high as 40%. In other words, for every 3 people you met on the street, 1 could be entirely owned, denied the right to live as a full human being. These were the individuals who did everything, from mining, plowing fields, building homes and temples, to serving in noble households, tending children, cooking meals, and even providing sexual entertainment at lavish banquets. When compared to slavery in pre-Civil War America, one of the most condemned chapters in modern history, the sheer scale of Roman slavery becomes even more staggering. At its peak, slavery in the United States encompassed about 12.5% of the population. While this was a horrific figure for a modern nation, it doesn't even reach half the proportion seen in ancient Rome. In absolute numbers, the Roman Empire owned millions of slaves. Some sources suggest that during the early imperial period, there may have been 6 to 7 million slaves across the empire. Crucially, in Rome, slaves weren't just a component of the economy. They were the core that kept the entire imperial system alive. In America, slavery was primarily focused on agricultural labor in the southern states, cotton and tobacco plantations. But in Rome, slaves were embedded in every aspect of life: economic, political, military, and cultural. They weren't only manual laborers, but also served as tutors for noble children, physicians for the elite, and accountants managing wealthy estates. Some were even trained to become philosophers, engineers, or overseers of other slaves. This level of integration made Roman slavery not just a historical stain, but a pillar of the social order. Another stark difference lies in the legality and cultural absorption of slavery in Roman life. The Romans didn't rationalize slavery by claiming slaves were less than human, as some racist ideologies once did in America. Instead, Romans simply saw slaves as property, speaking tools. Under Roman law, slaves had no legal personhood. They could not marry, worship, or own anything, not even their own bodies, unless permitted by their masters. The owner held complete power of life and death over a slave, without needing to justify it. A slave could be killed for the smallest mistake, and no explanation was required. In this system, no reason was necessary to execute, because in a Roman view, a dead slave was no more tragic than a broken instrument. When comparing the prevalence and legality of slavery between the two societies, it's clear that Rome not only had a larger slave population, but also a more deeply entrenched and ruthlessly administered system. In the United States, slavery faced opposition through abolitionist movements and eventually civil war. But in Rome, slaves had no voice. They had no rights to resist. Every uprising, such as the famous Spartacus Rebellion, was crushed in blood. After Spartacus's defeat, 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a flesh-and-bone warning to all. What's most chilling is this: the Roman Empire viewed slavery as natural. There were no societal debates, no human rights movements, no public critiques like in modern times. Slaves existed simply because they were captured, through war, sold by traders, or born into bondage. They were seen as byproducts of Roman glory. The very monuments we admire today, like the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the bridges, the public baths, were built on slave labor. Behind every stone lies blood, sweat, and silent, unrecorded death. So when we speak of Rome's glory, we must also confront the foundation beneath that glory, a society built on absolute dependency and the complete stripping of human dignity. It's a stark reminder that greatness does not always equal goodness. And in every era, the truest measure of civilization is not what it achieves, but how it treats its most vulnerable. The life of a slave in ancient Rome could hardly be called living in the true sense. It was an existence stripped of all human rights, a form of life severed from dignity. In that ancient society, slaves had no names, no status, and no right to be themselves. They were property, speaking tools, living objects valued not for virtue, but for labor capacity, utility, and obedience. A Roman slave was not permitted to marry. Marriage, a sacred bond for any free person, was for them a distant dream. If a slave fell in love or lived as husband and wife with another slave, the relationship held no legal weight. At a master's command, their partner could be sold and separated forever. No farewells, no protests. No one could oppose the will of ownership. Love between two slaves existed only in stolen moments, for even emotion itself did not belong to them. Beyond the ban on marriage, slaves could not own anything, not even themselves. Every breath, every drop of sweat, even their life and death, depended entirely on the decisions of their master. If the master wished, they could be sold, punished, or killed without explanation. No law protected them, for the law was written by and for the free, especially the elite. For a slave, even holding on to an old rag, a single coin, or a keepsake could be deemed theft from the owner. They were also denied the freedom to worship, pray, or choose their religion. Spiritual belief, the final refuge of suffering, was regulated and restricted. A slave could only practice faith if allowed by their master. Some were forced to abandon their old beliefs, coerced into adopting the religion of their owner's household, even made to perform religious roles during banquets for the sake of entertainment. Their spirit was shackled, their faith rejected. They had no sanctuary, not even within themselves. Worst of all was the violence, both physical and psychological, that slaves endured as an ordinary part of life. No one shielded them from beatings, rape, or daily abuse. A slap, a flogging, or being dragged through the streets in chains could happen for the smallest error, or no reason at all. Some cruel masters treated the beating of slaves as amusement, like taming wild animals to showcase dominance. Every wound, every bruise on their body stood as a testament to a society that denied humanity. But perhaps the most brutal fact was that a slave's body did not belong to them. The master could use it in any way, force them to labor from dawn until late night, exploit them sexually, or turn them into grotesque entertainment during feasts. To them, the body was merely a tool to serve others, without value, without limits. A man forced to wear a clown's costume, a woman displayed like a living object, a child worked until exhaustion. These were daily occurrences in an empire that gleamed on the surface but was rotting at its core. The condition of a Roman slave was one of voicelessness. They could not resist, could not choose, could not tell their own story, and thus, history rarely recorded their names. The grand monuments, the Colosseum, the paved roads, the towering villas, were built with the blood, flesh, and silent sacrifices of millions without names. They existed only to serve, and vanished as if they had never been. A human life, from birth to death, left no trace in the stream of history, save for the stones they laid upon one another. The harsh truth is, whether alive or dead, a slave remained personal property. If alive, they were used. If dead, they were replaced. And if they dared to resist, death would come, painful and humiliating. In a society where dignity was determined by status and power, the life of a slave was no more than a shadow. Today, as we look back upon that past, we do not merely witness the cruelty of a regime. We recognize the immense value of freedom and human dignity. Those who live without being acknowledged as human are the very ones who help us understand the deepest meaning of what it is to be a person. And the most frightening thing is not that history was once like this, but that if we forget them, if we fail to speak their truth, then silence will continue to extinguish the last remaining voices of those whose humanity was stolen. When people think of ancient Rome, they often picture grand temples, perfectly paved stone roads, and towering triumphal arches that symbolize a glorious civilization. But behind that light always lingers a forgotten shadow, the lives of millions of slaves. Human beings stripped entirely of their right to live, their right to dignity, and crushed under conditions so cruel that even imagining them today sends chills down our spines. A slave's day often began before the sun rose. In thick, stifling darkness, where the stench of sweat, damp earth, and rotting food mingled, they were jolted awake not by alarms, but by the barks of overseers and the cracking of whips against walls. Where they slept wasn't a bed or even a mat, but cold dirt floors or worn planks crammed tightly together in spaces too small to sit upright. Many had to sleep huddled in basements, storage rooms, abandoned animal sheds, or makeshift communal barracks. No windows, no light, no ventilation. These cramped quarters packed dozens of people together, men and women alike, with no curtains, no privacy, and certainly no sense of hygiene. They wore tattered clothing issued just once a year, regardless of rain, cold, or searing heat. The rough, filthy, and threadbare fabric, worn down from hard labor and rough washing, was all that shielded their bodies from the freezing nights or the burning sun. If a garment tore beyond repair, they had to tie it with rope or patch it with whatever scraps they could find. Their skin cracked from exposure, their hands calloused, their backs bent and twisted, but no one cared. They were tools, laboring tools not worth tending to. A slave's meal was a monotonous repetition of low-quality food, typically a thick porridge made from inferior wheat, perhaps a few onions or beans. Meat was a luxury, rarely tasted even on festive days. Drinking water came from communal wells or shared troughs, sometimes the same ones used for animals. The line between human and beast blurred here, for both were caged in darkness and treated the same. When a slave grew old and weak, there was no rest or care. No retirement, no doctors, no medicine. They were discarded, pushed into the streets to survive on scraps or perish in silence. Some were left at crossroads, in market corners or forest edges, lingering on the mercy of strangers. Others collapsed in the streets with no one stopping to help. Society no longer saw them as people, but as broken tools, waste from a machine that drained their labor to the last drop. Even before old age, a slave who became sick or slow was seen as a burden. They could be sold cheaply, traded for livestock, or punished for failing in their duty. Cruel punishments such as beatings, starvation, public tethering, or even torture with fire and blades were carried out legally. No one protected them. Roman law granted masters absolute power over life and death. A slave's body belonged to the master, so their pain, hunger, or death meant nothing to courts or to society. This cruelty was not confined to farms or factories. Even in noble households, domestic slaves lived in constant fear and tension. They had to remain alert all times, never distracted, never slow, because a minor slip like spilling wine, hesitating in response, or making eye contact with master could result in beating, expulsion, or being forced to amuse guests. Some wealthy families even turned slave abuse into entertainment, making them act out fake deaths, perform as animals, or stage active assault during drunken feasts. For female slaves, the suffering was even greater. Not only did they labor, they were also routinely subjected to sexual abuse. They had no right to refuse. Pregnancy was terrifying, for any child born to them would be considered property, not allowed to call them mother, and would inevitably be led down the same dark path. All of this paints a grim and hopeless picture. A life predestined from birth to be a tool, a commodity, a sacrifice for the empire's prosperity. No light, no love, no hope. This was a reality for millions enslaved under Rome's rule, where glory was built on bones and human dignity was crushed without hesitation. In ancient Roman society, where the power and glory of the empire were built upon the sweat, tears, and blood of millions of slaves, the dream of freedom was a distant luxury, almost unimaginable. People often praise the magnificent structures, resounding military victories, and profound philosophies that Rome left to posterity. But behind that dazzling curtain lies a brutal reality. The vast majority of those who helped construct the empire were never regarded as human beings. They were slaves, and for them, freedom was not a birthright, but a rare reward, sometimes granted as a condescending favor. Among the millions of enslaved souls bound to servitude, only a small few ever gained their freedom. These were often exceptional individuals, talented, educated, or fortunate enough to serve closely alongside their masters. They might have been scribes, doctors, stewards, or tutors, slaves whose loyalty and value pleased their owners enough that, on rare occasions, they were granted manumission near the end of life, or as an act of humanity tinted with vanity. One such rare account is that of Turos, a slave noted in historical records for earning the trust and compassion of his master. Turos was not only skilled, but unfailingly loyal. His story has been passed down as an example of slaves' chance at transformation. But this tale also underscores a painful truth. It required extraordinary talent, remarkable virtue, and an enormous stroke of luck for an enslaved person to even glimpse the door to freedom. And even if granted, their newfound liberty came burdened with the indelible marks of slavery, an invisible shackle they would carry for life. In contrast to these rare cases stood the harsh reality faced by the majority of slaves. Born into bondage or captured from faraway lands conquered by Rome, their lives were nothing more than a chain of labor, submission, and silent suffering from birth to death. They were denied education, forbidden to choose their paths, marry freely, or even dream. Everything they possessed, their bodies, labor, emotions, and often even their lives, belonged to their masters. And because they were seen as property, they had no claim to freedom. Though Roman law allowed for the manumission of slaves, this depended entirely on the will of the master, not the right of the slave. A slave could serve faithfully for a lifetime and still die in chains if their owner never made a decision to free them. Many masters even passed slaves down to their heirs as part of their estate, as if they were valuable assets, not human beings. Worse still, some slaves, despite their intellect, education, and role in contributing to their master's success and prestige, remained trapped in a degraded status. Some were promised freedom, only to be betrayed due to a change of heart or selfish calculation. Others were falsely accused, punished for imagined offenses, or demoted to hard labor as a form of retribution, losing all hope of ever escaping their condition. Stories like these extinguished even the faintest flickers of hope for many slaves. Even for those who were freed, life did not transform into a new chapter, as one might assume. Known as liberty freedmen, they still owed service to their former masters in various forms, were barred from participating in political life, forbidden to marry into the nobility, and were constantly viewed as once own. This social stain was hard to erase, and many faced contempt, suspicion, or exploitation from others. Thus, for the vast majority of slaves, the hope of a new life was nothing more than a mirage on the horizon, visible, perhaps, but forever out of reach. They continued to live in a cycle of labor, punishment, and silence, not because they lacked a desire for freedom, but because the society in which they were born and raised had denied them even the possibility of dreaming. Revolts like that of Spartacus became symbols of resistance, but also a testament to the desperation and inhumanity endured by Roman slaves. Freedom, if it existed at all, was not an open door, but a narrow crack in thick walls of prejudice, law, and power. Only a rare few, through brilliance, unwavering loyalty, or sheer luck, managed to slip through. For the rest, the invisible chains of society that measure human worth by ownership remain tightly fastened. And so, while ancient chronicles sing praises of Rome's triumphs and enduring philosophies, we must not forget that behind its radiant legacy lie countless buried lives, where freedom was merely a beautiful word, forever out of reach for those who were deemed speaking tools. Within the heart of the mighty Roman Empire, where law, engineering, and art reached historical heights, there existed a dark and barbaric reality, the institution of slavery. Roman slaves were not merely looked down upon as an inferior class. They were legally recognized as property, as soul-bearing animals, entirely subject to the whims of their masters. In a society where law was considered the foundation of civilization, for slaves, it served instead as a tool of humiliation and ruthless punishment. Slaves had no personal identity. They were rarely called by their real names, often renamed according to their master's whims, or labeled with derogatory terms that reflected their menial roles or degraded status. Roman law gave slave owners the ius vitae nescisque, the right of life and death. This meant they could beat, humiliate, rape, or even kill a slave without legal repercussions. A slave was considered a res, a thing, not a person. What was even more horrifying than the physical abuse was the fact that such violence was legal and, at times, embedded in the culture of entertainment. At the lavish feasts of the aristocracy, it was not uncommon for masters to force slaves into public sexual acts for the amusement of guests. Slaves had no right to refuse, no place to flee, no protection for their dignity or bodies. Beautiful children were turned into perverse entertainment for the powerful. The humiliation wasn't hidden in shadows. It happened in the open, amid laughter and the callous indifference of the crowd. One infamous example is the depravity of Emperor Tiberius. Historical accounts describe how he kept a group of young boys on the island of Capri, referring to them as his little fishes. He forced them to engage in underwater sexual games, touching his body as if nibbling bait. These children weren't just physically violated. They were mentally tormented, stripped of innocence, and robbed of their very humanity. Yet humiliation wasn't the end. Those who resisted, rebelled, or were simply deemed inefficient faced systematic and brutal punishments. One of the most notorious tools of punishment was the ergastulum, a private torture dungeon built on aristocratic estates. There, slaves were shackled, confined, and beaten without limits, hidden from the world. No sunlight, no adequate food, no chance to cry for help. The ergastulum was a hell on earth, where humanity was eroded and screams slowly dissolved into despair. Public punishments were also used as warnings, tools to reinforce the dominance of the ruling class. After the Spartacus Rebellion, captured slaves were executed by crucifixion along the Via Appia, stretching from Rome to Capua. 6,000 bodies hung for months as a chilling message to anyone daring to resist. These gruesome images were etched into collective memory, symbols of the inhumanity of an entire system of power. What is most terrifying is that within this context, no one thought anything was wrong. Roman society saw no moral issue in the abuse or humiliation of slaves, because slaves weren't considered human. The normalization of evil, when cruelty becomes routine, unchallenged, and even celebrated, made the pain of millions fade into a silence that history almost never recorded. Even those who were manumitted could not escape the lingering shadows of shame. Freedmen remained socially inferior, often required to participate in symbolic rituals of servitude to their former masters. Their freedom was incomplete, a token leniency granted by the very system that once crushed them. History is often written by the victors, the elite, the intellectuals. But the voiceless cries, the hollow gazes in the darkness of the ergastulum, the bodies trampled for aristocratic amusement. This too is history. It is the history of millions who lived and suffered without ever being named. The history of those who were never allowed to live as human beings. And if we still remember them, if we still tell their stories, then they have not been entirely forgotten. For recognizing that violence and humiliation were once legal is the first step toward ensuring that humanity never repeats those horrors again. Within the blood-stained and tear-soaked annals of Roman slavery, one occasionally encounters stories like faint glimmers in the darkness, dramatic, conflicted exceptions that seem to challenge the norm. These were slaves who, from the depth of suffering, rose to positions of power, some even stepping into halls of imperial influence, where even Rome's noblest freemen tread cautiously. One of the most striking of these cases is Cleander, a former slave who rose to become the emperor's trusted confidant, only to be executed on that same emperor's orders to appease an outraged public. Cleender's story is not just a personal tragedy. It symbolizes the illusion of upward mobility in a society built on oppression and domination. Cleander was originally from Phrygia and was sold into slavery before being brought to serve within the imperial court under Emperor Commodus. Through cunning ambition and at times ruthless pragmatism, he ascended the ranks, eventually becoming Praetorian Prefect, one of the most powerful positions in the Roman administration. In that role, Cleander not only commanded the elite imperial guards, but also controlled vast bureaucratic machinery, wielding near absolute power. Many knelt before him, sought favors, or bribed their way to high office. Cleander turned power into profit without hesitation. But that power came at a cost. When famine struck Rome and corruption ran rampant within the court, public anger surged, and Cleander became the perfect scapegoat. Though not solely to blame, he stood as the clearest symbol of decay at the heart of governance. Under mounting pressure from the populace and desperate to protect his throne, Commodus ordered the execution of the very man who had once been his right hand. Cleander was beheaded and his body displayed in the streets, a gruesome warning to anyone who believed they could rise above their slave origins through power alone. Cleender's death laid bare a bitter truth. No matter how high a former slave might climb, they were never truly accepted as equals among Rome's aristocracy. Talent, loyalty, and contribution could not erase the social stain engraved by slavery. Cleander was not alone in this path. Roman history records other freed slaves who became doctors, engineers, even tutors to aristocratic children. Yet, these exceptions never rewrote the rules. If anything, they highlighted the crushing injustice endured by the vast majority. Cleander's fleeting success came at the cost of total submission. He did not dismantle the system that had once oppressed him. He helped it run more efficiently for the ruling elite. Worse still, Cleander became entangled in the same cycle of power, corruption, and violence. When given authority, he did not liberate others like himself. He exploited them, just as he had once been exploited. His story demonstrates a harsh truth. In an unjust system, survival doesn't necessarily belong to the righteous, but to those who learn to play by the system's cruelest rules. The Roman slave system thrived by turning people into tools. It maintained control through fear, through public punishment, and by dividing slaves into distinct classes: household slaves, field slaves, palace slaves, ensuring they never formed solidarity. By dangling the illusion of advancement, the system lulled them into obedience. Figures like Cleander reinforced this illusion. Every time a slave saw one of their own rise to power, it reignited the false hope that they too might one day escape. But it was a mirage. Out of 6 million slaves in Rome, how many ever rose? And of those, how many survived long enough to enjoy what they'd earned? Stories like Cleander's leave us both awestruck and pained. Awestruck by the sheer resilience of the human spirit, how far someone could go from the lowest starting point. But far more painful is the realization that even the most extraordinary effort could not undo a society that valued human worth based on bloodline and power. Cleander was not a hero, nor was he a traitor. He was a symbol of both what was possible and what was ultimately impossible under a dehumanizing order. The Roman slave system buried countless lives, and no handful of success stories can redeem the whole. If Cleander's tale offers anything to remember, it is this. Every oppressive system creates illusions, exceptional figures to sustain its myth, and the truth behind those exceptions is often far more painful than their outward glory suggests. In the memory of humankind, there are roads that do not lead to life, but instead serve as grim reminders of pain, fury, and the brutalities of history. The Via Appia, once the pride of Roman civilization, connecting the capital to Capua, became the stage for one of the most chilling acts of retribution in human history. 6,000 slaves crucified alive along its 200-kilometer length. Their names were never recorded in the annals of history. No gravestones, no prayers, only broken bodies, hanging from crosses, as a silent message etched into the collective mind. Any challenge to the Roman order would be crushed without mercy. The revolt of Spartacus was more than a battle. It was a cry of desperation from thousands of slaves driven to the edge, with nothing left to lose but the yearning to live as human beings. Spartacus, once a warrior, turned gladiator slave, rose as a symbol of resistance. He did not fight for a throne, but for something simpler: freedom. Under his banner, tens of thousands of slaves from across the empire gathered, forming a massive force that shook Rome to its core. But empires do not yield. The Roman elite could not accept a world where order was reversed, where those once deemed property dared to raise a sword. Spartacus's rebellion was eventually crushed by General Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, and a figure as cold and calculating as he was powerful. After the final defeat, thousands of captured slaves were sentenced to a horrifying fate. Every few dozen meters along the Via Appia, a crucifix was erected, each bearing a living body, trembling in agony and utterly helpless as death crept in slowly over days. This cruelty was not about punishment. It was about control. It was designed to engrave a wordless terror into the conscience of society. Any defiance would be met with annihilation. In Roman times, law did not exist to protect the weak. It was an instrument of absolute obedience. Slaves were not seen as people. They were speaking tools, property to be used, beaten, abused, even killed without consequence. Crassus did not merely crucify rebels. He crucified hope itself. He nailed fear into the hearts of those still living. The bodies were left hanging for months, decaying in the heat, dust, and indifference of passers-by. No one dared to bury them. No one dared to weep. Only the quiet footsteps of wagons, soldiers, and merchants echoed along the blood-soaked road, silent, as if death were ordinary, as if such suffering were normal. History is not only written in books, it is written in bodies. The Via Appia is a living chronicle, where each cross told a story of the defeated, not because they were weak, but because they lived in an age that denied equality. Spartacus and his comrades built no fortresses, left behind no monuments, but they carved a deep scar into Rome's conscience and into memory of future generations. For there are deaths that, even when forgotten by name, carry eternal meaning, the meaning of standing up against chains. From the Roman state's perspective, the mass execution was not a crime, it was justice. But through the lens of humanity today, it stands as a painful testament to the decay of a system built on blood and tears. The peace of Rome, the feast of the aristocracy, the splendor of its architectural marvels, all stood atop the corpses of millions of slaves, among them the agonized screams of those crucified along the Via Appia. The world has changed, but the memory of such cruelty remains a warning. We look back at the past not only to feel compassion, but to learn how to live differently, to build a society where no one is treated as a commodity, and no one hangs as a symbol of submission. Spartacus failed, but his spirit and the voiceless cries of 6,000 others still echo as a reminder that no civilization can truly stand if it forgets its humanity. When people think of ancient Rome, they often envision grand constructions like the Colosseum, aqueducts stretching for tens of kilometers, opulent palaces, or stone-paved roads crossing the breadth of Europe. These architectural legacies still stand today, proudly representing one of the most radiant periods in Western history. Yet what many forget is that behind the splendor of marble columns and colossal domes lies the silent shadow of millions, slaves who labored to exhaustion, nameless and forgotten. Who were they? They were people seized from conquered lands, shackled, labeled as property, and sold in slave markets like commodities. They were strong men, young women, and even growing children, all thrust into the vast machinery of the empire. No one remembered their names. No one cared where they came from, whether they had families, or what kind of life they had lived before becoming tools. To their owners, they were merely free labor, living machines built to construct Rome's dream of eternity. They did the work no free citizen wanted. On construction sites, slaves hauled stones weighing hundreds of kilograms, working from before dawn until after dark, under blistering sun or bitter cold. They sweated, choked on stone dust, and collapsed under the lash if they faltered, or simply if they failed to try hard enough. A brick dropped on a foot, their life was over. A beam collapsed, no one mourned. Replacing them was routine. Worse still were those sent to the mines. These were places not meant for humans. The air was thin, the tunnels dark and unstable, and disease ever present. Slaves were forced to live underground, eating poorly, sleeping on cold stone, and working without air or sunlight. They dug out silver, copper, gold, iron, and mercury, a toxic metal that destroyed the nervous system. Those sent to mines rarely lived more than a few years. Many never saw the sky again. No gravestones were ever raised for these people. No chronicles recorded their names. When a bridge was inaugurated or a square completed, praise was given to the architect, the sponsor, or the emperor who issued the command. No one spoke of the callous hands that lifted each stone to the dome's peak. No one told the slave who took his last breath 300 feet below a mountain while mining. They died, buried under dirt, or discarded in forests like refuse, erased from the memory of the society they helped build. Even while they lived, their existence was barely acknowledged. Slaves had no right to protest. They could not quit their work. There was no such thing as wages or rest. While a soldier or free laborer might strike or leave their post, a slave had only two options: work or be beaten to death. In the eyes of Rome's elite, slaves were assets, like hoes or hammers, and if broken, they were discarded and replaced. The bitter truth is that these very people formed the foundation of the civilization the modern world so often praises. The Colosseum, the sewer systems, the aqueducts stretching for hundreds of miles, all were built by slave hands. There were no modern machines, no cranes, no drills, only human strength and relentless coercion. The glorious, radiant, and wealthy Roman Empire was constructed with the bones and blood of those denied the right to live as human beings. Today, When tourists marvel at the majestic beauty of ancient Rome, few pause to hear the silent cries from the stone. But if we are quiet enough, if we are willing to feel deeply enough, perhaps somewhere in the wind, in the dust, in the sunlight streaming through a broken arch, we may still hear the labored breaths, the falling sweat, and the nameless deaths that build an empire. That is a true cost of glory, and a reminder to every generation that we must never forget those whom history crushed into silence. For it is the nameless, burdened laborers, who remain the quiet soul behind all that humanity has ever built in the name of greatness. In ancient Roman society, where power was amassed through sword and submission, those who lived as slaves were not only shackled by iron chains, but imprisoned in a prolonged state of dehumanization. They were no longer considered fully human, but possessions, speaking tools, capable of labor and pain, yet denied emotion, will, or personal desire. Their existence was defined entirely by the needs and whims of their owners. It was a life without freedom, without identity, and most devastatingly, without protection from fear or lasting psychological torment. To live as a slave was to exist under constant surveillance, where every movement, every breath could be judged, punished, or extinguished without reason. There was no safety, no clear boundary between what was permitted and what was forbidden. A mistimed word, a misdirected glance, or a moment of visible fatigue could lead to lashes, chains, or sudden death, all met with the cold indifference of a master. This created a pervasive fear, not only of those in power, but fellow slaves, who might betray one another just to survive another day. This fear was not explosive, it was slow and insidious, seeping into the soul like poison. It bred self-doubt, eroded trust, and eventually silenced one's own emotions. Under such relentless control, slaves lost the ability to imagine a future, for the concept of tomorrow was a luxury. Tomorrow might bring a sudden sale, a beating or forced labor in the mines, never to return. They never knew how long they had, or when a single decision from their owner might erase their entire life in an instant. It wasn't just the body that was broken, it was the mind. Slaves were stripped of the right to love and be loved. They could not marry without permission. Their children were property of the master and could be sold at any time. Every personal bond was fragile, easily severed. It was a life without roots. Even if love existed, it had to be approached with indifference, because love brought pain more often than comfort. In places like the ergastulum, private underground prisons on aristocratic estates, slaves were chained and forced to labor endlessly in darkness, surrounded by screams, whippings, and the stench of wounded flesh. They ate scraps, slept on cold stone floors, and lived like ghosts. No one heard their stories. No one knew their names. And when they died, no one carved their names into stone. Their existence was an endless stretch of meaninglessness, unacknowledged, unremembered, unmourned. The tragedy deepened for those who lived in the lavish villas, close to the nobility. Their lives were no better. They were drained of strength from morning until night. Their needs and feelings were always secondary to the desires of their masters. They had no true rest, always on call, always serving. The smallest mistake could bring harsh punishment. The coldness of a master could plunge them into despair. For even living beside grandeur, there remained nothing more than shadows. The psychological crisis of slavery did not stem only from fear, but from an enduring sense of worthlessness. When a person is not recognized as a person, when they exist only as property, replaceable and expendable, then self-respect and self-belief begin to crumble. They learn to be silent, to stop hoping, to stop feeling, because feeling was the first step towards suffering. This loss of humanity was the cruelest aspect, not just because of whips or torment, but because they were forced to accept that they were no longer human. They were forced to live without being allowed to be themselves. That was the greatest prison, a prison of the soul. And the most terrifying truth was that many, after years of enduring, began to believe it, that they were born to be commanded, born to serve, born to endure and remain silent. While Roman monuments still tower against the European sky, many admire their majesty without remembering the true cost. Beneath the stones and beneath the majestic arches echo the cries of pain endured each day, the blood and tears of millions who were stripped of everything, even their humanity. And in the silence of those ruins, if one listens closely enough, one might still hear the unnamed whispers of the souls buried in the shadows, never once called by their true names. When people speak of ancient Rome, the first images that often come to mind are grand monuments like the Colosseum, legendary gladiators, powerful emperors, and elite legions conquering the known world. But behind these immortal symbols was a class of people whose names were never carved into stone, never sung in the annals of history, and often never even acknowledged as having existed. They were known by a single word: slaves. Among the millions of lives crushed by chains and humiliation, there were still those who rose in silence. They stood as symbols of unbroken spirit and the will to live with dignity. Figures like Epictetus and Arctes. These individuals did not leave a legacy of wealth or political power, but of intellect, endurance, and a spiritual legacy that endures to this day. Epictetus, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers of all time, was not born in a noble villa, nor raised in prestigious academies of philosophy. He was born a slave. His master was a high-ranking official under Emperor Nero, a ruler infamous for his cruelty. And it was within that brutal reality that Epictetus turned to philosophy as his only refuge to preserve dignity and inner peace. Epictetus had no freedom. He possessed no wealth, no status, no family. But he had a sharp mind and a keen sense of observation. Through the dim light of Stoicism, a school of thought that values reason, virtue, and acceptance of fate, he learned to let go of what lay beyond his control and to focus on the only thing a person can truly govern: oneself. After gaining his freedom upon his master's death, Epictetus did not seek power or revenge. He opened a small philosophy school in Nicopolis and taught the very ideas that had helped him survive his years of servitude. He taught that suffering does not come from circumstances, but from how we perceive them. He taught that even in chains, one could preserve inner freedom. His teachings were not theoretical. They were forged through lived experience. It is said that Epictetus walked with a limp, the result of his master breaking his leg. Yet he never voiced bitterness. He saw pain as part of fate, something outside his control, and therefore something to live with rather than resent. It was this form of acceptance without submission that made him truly free, even though he had once worn chains. Like Epictetus, another lesser-known but equally compelling figure is Arctes, a slave engineer linked to some of Rome's greatest architectural achievements. Little is known of his origins, except that he was a young Greek captured and enslaved, brought to Rome to work on imperial construction projects. Arctes possessed not only skillful hands, but a brilliant mind for engineering. In an age without modern machines, he contributed to the design and construction of the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the ancient world, the Dome of the Pantheon. This was a technical marvel that would not be fully understood for nearly 2,000 years. As a slave, Arctes' name was never etched onto commemorative plaques or recorded in official records. His achievements were erased from formal history. But his legacy lives on in every stone, in every perfect curve of the dome, in every column that still stands against time. Each brick he laid was not only part of a structure. It was a silent act of defiance from a man who refused to vanish quietly into obscurity. Arctes was not free. He had no right to say no. Yet he left behind something that hundreds of Rome's most powerful men could not: a living monument. His dedication and genius are proof that, even in the harshest conditions, human work can shine through. He needed no throne, no anthem, only a structure that stands with time, a testament that he existed, and that his life had meaning. Men like Epictetus and Arctes did not dismantle the brutal social order of ancient Rome, but they were tiny lights flickering in the darkness, reminding us that dignity is not born of status, but how one chooses to live, even when the world offers nothing but cruelty. Their stories are not a romanticization of slavery, but a reminder that history is not only written by victors, it is also quietly carved by the forgotten. And sometimes it is these very lives, small, humble, but unyielding, that become the most unforgettable pages of history. In ancient Roman society, where power was built on conquest and absolute obedience, the manumission of a slave, being granted freedom, did not mean complete liberation, nor did it mean equality. Though no longer legally considered property, those who had once lived in bondage continued to exist under the shadow of their past, surrounded by suspicious eyes, restrictive laws, and a value system that never truly accepted them as equal citizens. Even when a slave was granted freedom by their master, they were denied political power. Freed slaves were prohibited from holding public office, barred from marrying into the aristocracy, and never allowed entry into the upper echelons of society. Their social position, while improved from their days of servitude, remained low, trapped between two worlds, no longer slaves, but never truly free. They were called freedmen, a title that symbolized both hope and a lingering shackle. Part of this continued bondage came from the complex relationship between the freed person and their former master. According to Roman law, the freedmen still owed loyalty and service to the one who had owned them. Though no longer forced to perform hard labor or sleep in foul-smelling storehouses, they were often required to perform unpaid tasks, errands, duties, and obligations as a form of gratitude. The master retained the right to call upon them at will, without fair compensation. This preserved not only economic dependence, but also a psychological tether that was hard to break. This dependence was often disguised as gratitude, a moral obligation Roman society imposed on freed people. They were expected to bow their heads, to remain eternally thankful, and never forget that their freedom had been bestowed upon them, not earned. Over time, this mindset took root deeply. Many freedmen continued to refer to their former masters as dominus, lord or master, until the end of their lives. They internalized the belief that they were indebted, even after having endured years of suffering, abuse, and loss in the pursuit of a narrow slice of freedom. Beyond personal relationships, systemic discrimination was embedded in Roman law and society. A freed person would forever carry the label of former slave, and that status could affect their children. While future generations might slowly gain recognition as full citizens, their origin would always cast a shadow over their identity. Stories of wealthy, successful, and community-contributing freedmen were often treated as anomalies, exceptions, never the norm. A notable example is Trimalchio, a fictional character from Petronius's Satyricon. Trimalchio was a former slave who became extraordinarily wealthy, yet his affluence was mocked as garish and vulgar. He threw extravagant banquets, desperately trying to emulate the aristocracy, but was never truly accepted as one of them. His story reflects a bitter truth. Roman society did not forgive those who rose from the bottom if they had not been born to belong at the top. The existence of freed people exposed a contradiction within Rome's legal ethos. On one hand, the empire prided itself on its advanced legal system, on order and justice. On the other hand, at the core of that system lay rigid caste distinctions, where even those deemed human by law were never seen as equal. In Rome, freedom was not a universal right. It was a conditional privilege, one that could be granted, limited, or withdrawn. From this, one sees clearly, manumission in ancient Rome was not the end of bondage. It was merely a transformation from visible chains to invisible confinement. These were the chains of social stigma, imposed gratitude, and a legal framework designed to maintain the social hierarchy. Those who had once been enslaved, even when called free, remained suspended in a foggy limbo, somewhere between personhood and tool, between dignity and a guilt they never earned. This truth demands that we, when reflecting on history, not only marvel at Rome's achievements in monumental architecture, but also pause before the fate of those whose lives were lived, oppressed, and forgotten between the gilded lines of empire. They were not secondary characters in a glorious epic. They were the reverse side of the Roman coin, one side gleaming with pride, the other soaked in blood. When modern visitors gaze up at the colossal domes of the Roman Colosseum, stroll beneath the ancient aqueducts, or step into the majestic ruins of Roman palaces, few stop to consider that every stone in these marvels was once laid with flesh, sweat, and the lives of the nameless. Rome's architectural wonders, symbols of power, engineering, and grandeur, are not only historical legacies, but also silent witnesses to a heartbreaking truth. They were built with the pain and tears of millions of slaves. Slavery in Rome was not merely a phase of history. It was a dark foundation upon which an entire civilization was raised. Without the toil of chained hands, without the hunchbacks carrying stone beneath the scorching sun, without the sleepless nights filled with the crack of whips against flesh, there would never have been the glorious Roman Empire we admire today. The Roman Colosseum is one such testament. Every tier, every corridor, every step of stone was built by forced labor. Slaves, from conquered Greeks to Eastern captives, hauled limestone blocks weighing hundreds of kilograms from quarries into the heart of Rome. They not only built the arena, but also died beneath its foundations. And after construction ended, their blood continued to stain the arena floors, not as builders, but as victims of entertainment, thrown into death matches with beasts and gladiators to amuse Rome's elite. But their suffering didn't stop in the blood-stained circus. The aqueduct system, one of Rome's proudest engineering feats, channeling water from mountain springs to the capital, also consumed tens of thousands of slave lives. Men, women, even children were forced to work day and night under brutal conditions, scaling cliffs, tunneling through rock, hauling materials through wild forests. Many perished without graves, their bodies lost to the very water they had helped bring into Rome, used for bathing, gardening, and cooling dining halls of the free. And what of the palaces, the opulent villas of the Roman aristocracy? From floor tiles to marble columns, from intricate mosaics to bronze chandeliers, each element was crafted by hands never acknowledged. Slave artisans were exploited to exhaustion, replicating beauty they themselves could never enjoy. They lived in dark basements, ate scraps, and died silently within the walls of the splendor they created. The tragedy lies in the irony. Within these grand structures, history preserved the glory of the Roman Empire in images and marble, while bearing all traces of those who built them. There are no tombstones for these slaves, no names in chronicles, not a single statue in remembrance. They were erased as though they never existed. And yet, their truth remains, etched in the cracks of the Colosseum, in the damp stone of the aqueducts, and in the crumbling pillars of noble estates. Today, as we stand before these ancient marvels and marvel at Roman ingenuity, we must also bow our heads in remembrance of the unnamed souls. For Rome's glory is not only the story of emperors and generals, but also an indictment of society built on oppression. History is not only written by victors. True history lies in what endures, in every brick, every whip mark, every unheard cry. And when we look up at Rome's monuments, we do not see only the brilliance of a vanished empire. We also see the ghostly presence of slaves, human beings once treated as tools, yet who left eternal marks on stone, on civilization, and on the conscience of humankind. When the story of those erased from history draws to a close, what lingers is not just a horror of cruelty, but a profound reminder of human dignity, a value that seems simple, yet has been trampled upon for centuries. The slaves of ancient Rome, treated as living tools and soulless property, were still human. They had desires, emotions, fears, love, and dreams they were never allowed to dream. They, not emperors or monuments, were the silent lifeblood that sustained the Roman Empire, and they remain the shadowed figures who illuminate our moral conscience today. Looking back at their lives is an act of facing the truth, that civilization does not equal compassion, that a culture may reach great heights in architecture, law, and thought, yet still harbor the most savage treatment of its fellow beings. Children sold before they could speak. Men worked to death in mines to extract silver for aristocratic banquets. Women forced to degrade their own dignity for elite amusement. People discarded after a lifetime of service, like broken tools. These are not scattered fragments of the past. They are mirrors reflecting into the present. We live in a modern world where human rights are spoken of daily, where freedom and personal dignity are touted as cornerstones of civilized society. But how far have we really come? When workers are still exploited in sweatshops, when children are trafficked into sex trades, when women are treated as commodities along borderlands, when the homeless are dismissed as useless by the public. Perhaps today's cruelty has only changed its form, clothed itself in more polished words, more sophisticated systems, and therefore become harder to see. The story of Roman slavery demands that we not turn away from what still echoes today. Iron shackles may be gone, but they've been replaced with bonds of debt, prejudice, class, race, and gender. There may no longer be blood-soaked gladiatorial arenas, but we have media stages where people are publicly shamed and dehumanized for profit. There are no more underground or gashla, but there are still sweatshops, forced labor camps, and isolation wards where the vulnerable are denied their humanity. The greatest lesson from this painful history is a call for empathy and compassion. not to drown us in despair or resentment, but to nurture belief that we can choose differently, that in each small act, how we treat the server at a cafe, the garbage collector, the stranger on the street, we are shaping a society and deciding whether it has humanity or not. History is not merely something to memorize. It is something to hold up as a mirror to ourselves. And so, as we stand for the lasting monuments of Rome, the arenas, temples, aqueducts, we must also remember that every stone, every wall, was built with the sweat, tears, and lives of those whose names were never written. They are the ghostly figures hidden in the grand tales often told, the voices smothered beneath the cheers of conquest. But now, as we tell their story, we begin to return to them a voice, a piece of the humanity that was denied for too long. We cannot change the past, but we can change how we see it, and more importantly, how we walk into the future. If each of us pauses, even briefly, to hear the faint voices of those left behind by history, we may learn the most vital lesson of all, that true progress lies not in power, achievement, or brilliance, but in our capacity to love, to show mercy, and to protect life, no matter whose life it is. And perhaps, in a world still bearing many wounds, that empathy born from history may be the beginning of healing. The story of Roman slaves is not just a story of the past. It is our story as people of today, striving to live with more kindness, more humanity, and to leave no one forgotten. History is not just made of numbers, battles, or the names of kings and emperors. History is also the whisper of the nameless, the trace of countless forgotten lives, and a lesson of humanity etched in blood, in tears, and in hope. When we revisit the stories of the past, whether dark or dazzling, we are not merely studying history. We are holding a mirror to the present. I hope that today's story, though perhaps heavy at times, has taken you on a quiet journey to feel, to understand, and to appreciate the life you have. Because sometimes, simply being free, having a roof over your head, and resting at the end of a long day is already a gift that millions before us once longed for in vain. And now, as night has fallen, let your mind find rest. Close the pages of ancient history and leave your worries behind, beyond the threshold of time. May you have a peaceful, gentle sleep, like the wind brushing past crumbling stone walls, lulling the souls of the past into eternal dreams. Sleep well, and I'll see you again in the next story.